All right, so kia ora, Nisambula Vinaka, Namaste, Assalamu alaikum, Malole le, Talofa Noya, and warm Pacific greetings. Welcome to the second webinar of the Pacific Online Learning and Teaching Network. Before I introduce our presenter, I'll just note a few housekeeping rules. In true Pacific style, our webinars are quite informal, so we welcome a good talanoa at the end of the presentation. We also have a Facebook group, a Twitter group, a YouTube account, and a web page where we make all of these recordings and information around the webinars available. I'll post this in the chat box, so do check it out. And if you're not a member, you can join, drop your email address as well, and I'll add you to the emailing list. I'll also post the flyer for our next webinar in the chat box, so you'll have details of our upcoming webinar as well. There are two ways in which you can engage with this presentation. We encourage you to speak, have a good conversation, ask your questions. If you don't feel comfortable in asking questions, you can pop them in the chat box and I'll ask them on your behalf as well. Finally, I'm going to request that you keep your mic on mute while the presentation's going on. Those are our housekeeping rules. So I'll introduce our presenter for this webinar. Associate Professor Vinesh Chandra is an academic with the Faculty of Creative Industries, Education and Social Justice at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. He's an academic lead for international engagement and the STEM subject area coordinator. His teaching and research focuses predominantly on technology, STEM and global education. He's taught in early childhood, primary, secondary and tertiary settings in Australia and several developing countries, including Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Malaysia and China. More recently, Associate Professor Chandra has led 2 Australia Awards graduate certificate programs in STEM education in Papua New Guinea and is currently leading a 3rd one. He's also leading several other Australia Award initiatives in Papua New Guinea. His book, Share, Engage, Education, Seeding Change, for a Better World highlights some of the work that he's undertaken with his team in 8 developing countries through the SEED project. He's received the Peter Bryce Award from the Pacific Circle Consortium in recognition for his exceptional dedication and lifetime commitment to education ideals in the Pacific and beyond. I welcome Associate Professor Vinesh Chandra to present today. Welcome, Professor, Associate Professor.
Thanks, Jalal. It's a pleasure, and thanks to everybody for joining this. Well, for us, it's still morning. I presume it's afternoon for you guys. My apologies. There's a mower running next to where I am, so there may be a bit of this intermittent noise, and it won't go for long. So I'll certainly raise my voice and. But thanks, I truly appreciate the opportunity and to meet people that I can really connect with, and when Praneeth and I, we are both at QUT, and when he invited me to join, I was thoroughly delighted, and he said, I said, what's this thing about? And he says, well, it's just a bit of a talanoa, as Jalal said, that just a bit of chit chat. And normally when us Fiji people meet each other, when people from Fiji meet, the first question they ask is "Tum kahan ke hai?" Where are you from? And that's how the conversation starts. So you might have found that that's the way we started. Where are you from? And then you start talking about the villages they are from and so on and so forth. But anyway. Thank you so much. And in this presentation, I'll try and focus on 2 things. Firstly, I want to talk about my work, my project, and how I have worked with like-minded people to make a difference to education in the Pacific. And then I'll talk about the PNG project, which is a bit more recent. So I'll share my screen. And if at any point, now I'll just stop. No, there's no videos in this, so it should be fine. If at any point there are any issues, please just let me know. I hope you all can view my screen. So I hope all's going well, and just do a thumbs up or thumbs down if there are any issues, or just let me know. So I hope all of you can see my screen.
Yep, all good.
Okay, all right. So I'll just give you a bit of my background. So I was born in Fiji, and this is the primary school that I went to. So I come from Dubu, which is a village near the town of Singatoka, and this is the primary school that I went to. And then from here I went to Dubu Secondary School. And after finishing at Dubu Secondary School, I then went to USP, and that's where I graduated. And it was in 1981. I graduated with a Bachelor of Science and a graduate certificate in education. I was hoping that Stephen Rutuva would be joining. I think we might have both finished at the same time. But anyway, so after finishing my studies, I then got a job with, as we all do, if you have a teacher qualification. I started teaching at Nasinu Secondary School. But as I was teaching, I was very keen on enhancing my knowledge. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was a master's degree. I think there was also this hope that I'll run away from teaching. So I completed my master's degree by research. It was in chemistry, again at USP, and you know, that didn't quite take me very far. There are very few opportunities at the time. And then my future sort of changed a bit. In 1986, I migrated to Australia, thanks to the Australian, the Queensland government. Education Queensland is the body that looks after teacher employment. They actually sponsored me to come and teach in Australia. And hence, for the next 20 years, my job pretty much became teaching in high school. And I was a math science teacher. And then in 2005, I completed my doctorate, again, working part-time. I also did my master's part-time. I lived in Brisbane, and Curtin's on the other side of the country. And that's where I developed a strong passion for online learning, because for the entire duration of my study, which was looking at the impact of web-based learning on high school students in science and physics classes, the internet was new. And but nonetheless, you know, my study was, I was keen. I was quite motivated because I saw online learning as a possibility. So I completed my doctorate, and I'm also pleased to say that I completed it in less than the minimum time they allow for part-time studies. So what's happened is I've got roughly about 20 years of teaching experience, you know, teaching math science. And then at the university, I now have roughly about 20 years of teaching experience. My expertise has been predominantly in the area of technology, STEM, and global education. So I've got this picture here of my school because it kind of starts the whole process of how I began my journey of engaging with the Pacific, I suppose, and the rest of the world. So in 2010, I went back to my school. It was the time when we had a place in Fiji, a small place in the village that we sold. And I thought this was it for me. And I thought, you know, I'll go take some photos of, you know, where the teachers hit me, as they do or used to. In those days, some probably still do. So I just went to the school just to take some photos, more for my grandchildren. So as I walked around the school, the head teacher was very welcoming. And he sort of said, well, it's so nice you've come. He took me around and showed me all the different, the school hadn't changed much, from my point of view, the way teaching was happening was very much the same. Classrooms looked very familiar. And one of the questions that I asked him was, where's the library? And he showed me this empty space, this empty room that used to be my library when I was a student there. And I was quite shocked, that in this day and age, now that we have gone into the next century, we still have schools with no books. Children have no opportunity, let alone technology. So I had a conversation with the head teacher. He says, well, we are struggling and so on and so forth. And I talked about computers and he said, well, computers, it's a dream. It may happen, or, it's, we just can't see it happening. So I sat on it for a couple of years, and then my wife, who happens to be a librarian, my wife and I managed to gather some secondhand laptops from the university and friends and so on and so forth. And what happened was, we went back to the school and we spent 3 weeks with the teachers just to understand what the situation was. So it was all pretty much financed by us. We gave up our time, and we just spent time to understand what the situation was. And we realized how much there was a need for support in these schools, particularly in rural and remote areas. So I'll just stop this sharing for a minute and I'll open another screen. The experience that we had in Fiji at the school motivated us to actually form a loose group of academics, friends, family members. And it saw the birth of the C project. So the C project stands for Share, Engage, Educate. So it's a project that we started in 2011, pretty much. That's when I wrote my first blog. And so this whole idea of supporting schools through the donation of library books and computers and a bit of professional development activity and student outreach projects evolved. And in the past 10 years or so, a bit more than 10 years now, what's happened is we have been able to support schools, probably, I think it'd be close to 80 schools in 7 developing countries with no real money. It's the in-kind support that we get and the voluntary work that we have done. So if you go to my blog, thecproject.org, I've written little stories of how these projects evolved. It's got students' experiences, it's got experiences of the people on the ground, and so on and so forth. And then with that same idea, more recently, I've, our big idea was starting off with something whereby we could support schools with books, but getting books across is a very unidirectional sort of an approach, whereby all we are trying to do is get the literature from this side to the other side. I think there is, with digital technologies, there's lots of opportunities for getting stories from these different parts of the world and putting them on a forum, putting them on a site whereby anyone can read, hey, what's life like in a village in Fiji? Why can't children in schools be writing this? It then gives computers a new meaning. And so I've recently set up a library, a digital library, which is a work in progress. And I've called it the C Digital Library. The big idea is that it's a place where children, it's a place where you can find books. It's books written by, with, and for children. So it's an interesting idea. And, I've said a bit about this library. And as I'm saying, that, all this is voluntary work, takes a fair bit of time. but I'll get there. There are people, there are schools who are interested in coming on board, sharing ideas and getting students motivated. These two girls here are my granddaughters, by the way. Gwenny's on the right-hand side and Margot's on the left. And then when you go in this library, there are books. I've got some books on Fiji, I've got some books on Papua New Guinea, and then some books on science and so on and so forth. So it's my big dream to get this underway. I've also done work on places, you know, just to put some examples, like our Girmit, our indentured labor, our indenture history is quite important. I've done books on that as well, just to sort of get the wheels rolling. Some of my students here at QUT have also shared the books on this site. So that's how much work I've sort of done to motivate or to bring about or to get started with my connection with the Pacific. And so moving on, you know, I've always believed in, you know, answering this big question, what does my education mean? So that work, that experience that I had in the Pacific always aligns with the work of Professor Fred Hollows, a great New Zealander, you know, who was a professor, but he didn't sit in his office and just wrote and produced stuff. He actually went in the field. And that's why I relate to him, you know, whereby I think we can apply our knowledge in the real world to understand what we are doing and why we are doing it. I think throughout the world that all people need is a bit of an opportunity. If you look at the story of one of the greatest actors of all time, the late Sidney Poitier, you know, he came from the Bahamas to New York to wash dishes. And at the age of 18, he was still illiterate when someone took an interest and gave him a chance to basically, you know, learn to read and write, and look what became of him. So how did I get involved in PNG? So basically, my engagement in PNG was I was invited by my head of school, Professor Dan Mallett, who in this photo is the guy with the glasses on the right-hand side. And David Koza is the project manager. And he says, well, would you like to come and be involved in this project? And I was thoroughly delighted, because for 10 years, all this work that I was doing was voluntary. It was just so hard to find any support, any sponsorship. And I felt that, well, here's my great chance. If I want to make a difference, what can I do? How can I work with these people to be involved? And on the right-hand side, I've got a photo of the book that I wrote based on the work that I've done in the Pacific, mostly on a voluntary basis. Share, engage, educate, seeding change for a better world. It's got stories of my own experiences, but also the experiences of my students and others that I've worked with. So what was the course? So what was the engagement in PNG? So in this context, for those of us who are from Australia, we probably know the Australia Awards program. So there was the AAPNG awards that were basically on offer. So it was the task was to run or deliver a short course that was sponsored by the Australian government under its foreign aid program. And the cost of the program eventually, the first part of the program was about $2 million. So in the original design, the task was to deliver the course to a cohort of senior secondary teachers. And the course was a graduate certificate in STEM education, where we delivered 8 units. Now, traditionally, what happens is in these courses, the participants come to Australia. So in this particular instance, what happened was that we said, okay, we'll run this over 2 6-week blocks, and each block would be delivered in an intensive mode over 1.5 weeks at the QUT campus. So basically that was the structure, and it'd be done in 6 months. And the other important thing was that when these participants came, when the awardees came to Brisbane, they'll have Australian experience. Now, if you look at the image on the right-hand side, that's an image that of a photo that we took when we did a small tour around Port Moresby. And the one on the left is another one. So what was PNG's? How come PNG got so much interested in STEM education? I think it's really very interesting. And I think if we look at the forward thinking or the approach adopted by PNG, what's happened is they'll probably be one of the few, if not one of the first countries where they are looking at the whole STEM agenda nationally. And they had their own reasons, and I've got a couple of comments here made by Nick Kuman, who was the education minister, and he's sort of saying, why should we be leaning towards STEM education? Now, one of the things about STEM education is that people talk about STEM education, and what they really mean is more of maths, science, technology, engineering. But the approach that we take in STEM education is a bit different, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So if we look at PNG, some of the facts, if we look at the HDI rankings, PNG is quite different in terms of on a number of variables. For those of us who know the HDI index, it's the world's second largest island, population of 9 million. Citizens speak more than 715 languages. It's a lovely country, very pretty, but the terrain is so rugged, thick vegetation, there's high rainfall, water and electricity. The supply of both these is a real issue. And I think from memory, only 20% have reliable electricity supply across the country. And then there's also issues with water and mosquito-borne diseases. And, if we look at the situation at the moment with COVID, for example, only 4% of the population is vaccinated. So there's a whole range of different challenges in terms of, every country in the world is different. And these are the facts, some of the facts about PNG. So from my point of view, the other reason why I got very much interested, other than I have a very strong belief in making a difference in the Pacific and in other similar environments, for those of us who are in academia, I think, or at least from the QUT's point of view, a project such as this connects the three main areas that our university is focused on. The first thing is teaching, second one is research, and the third one is leadership and engagement. And I think what happened with this project, or the opportunities that I saw, the value that I could gather, was that there were connections across all these. So with STEM education, what does STEM education really mean? Now, STEM education is, and here's a diagram. In a nutshell, this is how I see STEM education and the way it's interpreted. STEM education is, in fact, the way we see it and the way we deliver it in our courses, is that we adopt an integrated approach. So the idea is that science will be science, maths will be maths, so on and so forth with engineering and technology. But what we are looking for are the conceptual connections. Now, if you look at the literature will strongly say the value of making these connections. And I have lived experiences, as a math science teacher in a high school, one of my real challenges was that in a maths class, I'll be a maths teacher. in a science class, I'd be a science teacher, but I never got a chance to integrate those two ideas or ideas from one to the other. For example, if I taught students how to draw a graph in maths, I never really got, unless I was lucky enough to have the two classes where the students were the same, never got a chance to really apply them when I got into a science class where students were gathering data and plotting a graph. For them, it was just drawing a graph, not really applying the maths ideas. For those of us who can go back to grade 9, grade 10 maths, this idea of y equals mx plus c, this is the gradient, this is the intercept. What does it really mean? And I think when you take the maths into the real world, make connections, when you connect, draw graphs and say, hey, this gradient idea is at which a car moves, if you're doing something with speed, time, or something like that in physics. So our approach is about integration, finding ways in which concepts connect. And this is this idea by Bybee is a science educator, and his idea is, science 1.0 is like hardcore science knowledge. But when you start looking at science 2.0 or the 2.0 area, for instance, over here, that's where you start looking for overlap between science and technology. When you look at 3.0, it's looking for the connections across. When you look at the 4.0, of course, it means across all of them. You don't necessarily have to have connections across all of these. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that once students know why they are doing something, they're more likely to engage with the subject and its content. From my point of view, in a place like Australia, I presume New Zealand and various other places, students' interest in STEM subjects is on the decline, whilst what the futurists predict that 75% of the jobs in the future will require STEM skills. And I think the real problem is that we do not necessarily look for connections. Students are always not really very clear in terms of why they are doing what they're doing. So that is where our STEM approach really works. And I think it creates that opportunity. It doesn't take away anything in terms of the content within each discipline, but what it does is it enhances the content. So that's a bit about the integrated approach that we adopt. So anyway, we got to Port Moresby. This was in January, February 2020, and we worked with one group of the participants, and we delivered what was known as the pre-course workshop. It went for 1 week in Port Moresby. So we worked with this 26 group of teachers, and then Australia Award said, well, we really need to have a second cohort as well. So conversation started for a second cohort, and we said, okay, this is the way we're going to be doing it, 2 4-week blocks. And that's how the delivery can occur. So things look very good. We also visited 4 schools and saw bits and pieces of Port Moresby, got to see what some of the challenges were in schools. Now, if we look at these schools, I presume these are not the countries or the schools that we find in rural areas. But in here, the challenges were fairly common. Some of the classes would have up to 60 to 70 students. And when you have a situation like that in classrooms that weren't built for 60 or 70 students, then that in itself starts with problems. So so anyway, we had the first group of participants, and we finished off. All was good to go and more, and then we went with the first phase. So sorry, the second phase, where the participants arrived as planned, all good to go, and we said, okay, these are the people who will be teaching these units. But then at the same time, in March 2020, COVID said, I'm here too. And our intentions was to do, as I said, the pre-course workshop, have a break, then we deliver some units, have a break where the participants go back to PNG, then we do the next block, and then the students graduate. So COVID and a well-laid plan, basically in March, went down the drain. So COVID basically forced us to rethink how we will do things. You know, it was one of those times where the goalposts just kept shifting. And we had to say, well, okay, we've got this task to do. How do we address this issue? How do we keep the course going? And as a consequence, the only solution to the problem was that we need to do this online. So one of the biggest problems that we had was, the first thing was technology. Now, all these teachers, so we had two groups of teachers by this stage to think about, 26 from the first cohort and 26 from the second. By this stage, we've got two groups of teachers to think about. They were from all over Port Moresby and, as you know, all over Papua New Guinea. And as you know, in most of these countries, teachers aren't particularly well paid. So you really can't afford good technologies. And how do you run an online course from a phone with a broken screen that is 5 years old? So the idea that we proposed to Australia Awards and DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs, was that all these students need a laptop. And I was thoroughly impressed. You know, we were very delighted that they saw the value in ensuring that each of the participants had a laptop, a brand new laptop that they could use for the duration of the course. And the idea was that the laptop would go back to the schools once the courses ended. Now, in terms of the actual investment in these courses and the amount of money that's spent on acquiring this technology, the cost of the technology was just very small indeed. So that was one issue. So now the teachers, we managed to get, and the costs of the technology, acquiring the laptops in PNG was high. So we sent them from Australia and paid duty and so on, and still saved a bit of money. The next issue was connectivity. So when people are all over the place, it becomes a real problem. And so connectivity is a big issue. Now we have, as an example, at QUT, when I'm on campus, we have a download speed of roughly about 200 megabits per second. That's probably what we have in most institutions in Australia and New Zealand. But in Port Moresby, it's down to about 10. Now, if it's down to about 10 in Port Moresby, in a hotel, which is rated 5 stars, if that's the download speed, think about some of these remote and rural areas. But nonetheless, we managed to get the connectivity issue. We got all of them data for the duration of the course, and also got them dongles so they could actually connect. We also negotiated with the Department of Education for some study time. So when the courses were running, the schools would give the teachers 1 day a week to do some studies. And then we also prepared ourselves for a whole range of unseen issues. So then came the third phase, and we said, okay, we'll do the first half of the course, and basically we'll do this with the teachers in their locations. So wherever they were, we'll do this for first 4 courses in this way. And so it was from their home locations. It was difficult, but it did work. And I won't go through this because I'm mindful of the time as well. And I found that, the level of commitment of these students was just very high. Now, this is an example of an activity that one of the teachers is doing. Now, I teach a unit, or I teach 2 units in this course. First one is project-based learning. And in project-based learning, I get students in my mainstream and also in Papua New Guinea make a boat, model of a boat. So we try and look at the boat from a science perspective, from a technologies perspective, engineering, and so on. I'd never imagined that the teachers or the students we worked with in Papua New Guinea would be so committed. They actually got into it. And as you can see, here's an example of the boat that one of the teachers built. She sent me this series of photos, then tested the boat. And unlike here, the story is very different. The way we think, the creativity that sometimes resides amongst us is quite different. And how do we deal with critical thinking is a different thing altogether. And with teachers, some of them struggled making connections. This is Rafael Ulka. His Zoom attendance was about 90%. And what he'd do is he'd go up a hill. As you can see, he's surrounded by hills or mountains. So as soon as the school finished, he'll go up there. And each time he came, he'd be catching his breath. He's walked up this hill for 30 minutes or so before he can make a connection. But this in itself shows what online learning is all about. And, the level of commitment that these people had. So then we started with the second cohort. It was again online, and another 26 teachers. And then we went into another model where what AAPNG decided to do was get the teachers into a hotel in Port Moresby. So all teachers came for the remaining units. They came into a hotel in Port Moresby, and we delivered the course. And basically, we had facilitators in the room, and we delivered the course from QUT online. Again, because of COVID restrictions, we had a whole range of different issues. Nonetheless, it worked. And if I look at the whole group of students, it was truly amazing and inspirational in terms of what they were able to do. In the last unit they do, that's a unit that I do as well. It's applied STEM. How do you intend to apply your ideas in the classroom? And these were some of the ideas. How are you going to take this integrated approach? Because with integrated approach, there is a strong focus on project-based learning, strong focus on inquiry learning, and problem-based. Some of the ideas, and there was a strong push towards, okay, how do we bring in ideas into the classroom where we focus on farming, for example, or water purification, where we develop models, develop systems where students collaborate with others and find ways in which they can deliver some real world outcomes. Farming, for example, the argument was for many children, they won't go to university. When they go back to the villages, if we give them some farming practices through connections with science or technology, at least they'll be able to apply that, and they should be able to live their lives successfully, or at least have another avenue to focus on. So as I said, the goalpost kept moving, but we still made goals. And I think one of the things that, some of the outcomes, we had excellent connections with, or have developed excellent connections with the people on the ground. We've also, it made me realize the actual value of foreign aid and the money that's spent on foreign aid. So according to the information that I've gathered, 21% in every $100 of our gross national income we spend on foreign aid. This, in my view, was an excellent project because it has the potential to make a difference. And I'll show evidence of the potential in a minute as well. We have made a difference on the ground in a country where integrated STEM has found its place in assignments. And, people always, we've got a close group where they're always talking about what they're doing in their schools. We've developed networks. We're also trying to produce an edited book with the teachers based on what they're doing in the classrooms. And it's of the 50 students. So we started with 26 in each group. 2 of them left early. We were left with 49 students, or it might be 48 students who actually graduated from the course, which in our view was an excellent outcome. The teachers also rated the course very favorably, across all of these indicators: quality of the course, relevance of learning, relevance of course to the PNG curriculum, relevance to context, quality of assignments, quality of digital technologies, the effectiveness of Blackboard interface, and the overall. If you look through this, most of their scores are in either very good or excellent, which in our view was an excellent outcome. Now, I was in Papua New Guinea 2 weeks ago, and and basically what we did, my colleague Dan Mallet and I, we engaged in phase 6 of the project, and the phase 6 of the project was that we do a post-course workshop. And what we did was, over the 5 days, of course, talk about some of the things that the teachers wanted to know more about. But we did a 2-day mini teacher conference where the teachers presented. We gave each one of them 10 minutes to tell us how they were applying their knowledge in the classroom. Now, in the assignments, they had said this is what they'll be doing. But here, the idea was, how are you applying this knowledge in the classroom? And again, of all the presentations, everyone had something that was either already implemented or on its way to be implemented. And I thought that was a fascinating outcome. Now, I've just got some examples here. This is an example of one of the teachers. He's a science teacher. He got his students to build a model of a hydroelectric power station. And how does it generate electricity? And I was thoroughly impressed by the creativity that resides in this. I couldn't do it myself, especially when you don't have the right materials. And I said, how did you do it? He said, well, I gave students the project, then they had to work on their own outside school. They improvised, they needed a turbine. They didn't have one, so they went somewhere and saw this old computer. They took out the old computer that someone had dumped. They took out the blade that's used in the fan to make or use in this instance. This is an example of another teacher who's engaged in project-based learning, where her students were making masks. And it's, again, such a great thing where you're looking at so many aspects of science and technology. You bring in mathematics as well. And you think a bit deeper, not only about COVID, but how you can deal with it. And this is an example of a teacher who's a student in 10A. He's just managed to get a magnet from somewhere, and he's demonstrating how a motor works. And from my point of view, what the teachers have done here is merely facilitated the students' thinking and learning. So I think we've made a difference, we have made a difference to the teachers. It's so pleasing, so satisfying that you go in a place and you see that this is what you're trying to teach and this is what's happened. And one of the teachers was so delighted that whilst we were there, or during the course, his wife gave birth to a son, and his son is named Vindan. And Vindan is, so V-I-N is me, the Vinesh bit, the first 3 letters. And then Dan is, of course, Dan Mallet, who's my colleague. And some of these people, they've just become a part of me in a way. We're always talking to each other through Facebook and other social media whenever the opportunities arise. So what's the future for what we've done in Papua New Guinea? As I said, the grad cert STEM in education, there's a cohort 3 that's starting. We go back to Port Moresby in June, at the end of June, to do our pre-course workshop. We once again are using a slightly different model. The borders have opened, but again, we want to do some in country and hopefully some in Australia. The PNG government and DFAT Australia Awards, they've also, we're also delivering some professional development activities to upskill some other teachers in STEM education. We are working at the moment with the University of Goroka to develop a course that they're hoping to start, and it's a diploma in STEM education. And I think this is one of the ways in which knowledge can be extended. It's not just left with us here in countries like Australia and New Zealand. If we can upskill the people and give them the opportunities, the tools, then I think it works well for everybody. So I just like to finish off with a couple of questions for us to think about, maybe not just now, maybe later. What can we do? I forgot the can. What can we do to make a difference to the people who live in the world that we have come from? And this is more for us migrants, What can we do? How can we make a difference? And then the other one is, how can we build connections in the Pacific through education? So that's basically what I had to say. Sorry, Jalal, I might have gone a bit over time, but I'll just stop sharing now.